The millionaire dated the waitress in secret. Now he must choose between her and his fortune. Andrew Harrington never expected a single cup of coffee to change his life. One snowy evening, he slipped into Harbour Diner, a tiny family-owned spot outside the glitzy part of town. He only wanted to warm up, gather his thoughts, maybe plan his next big business move. But from the moment waitress Sophie Evans flashed him that gentle smile, Andrew's entire world tilted on its axis. Now, plagued by secrets and a looming ultimatum, he stands on the brink of losing either the woman he adores or the million-dollar fortune he's spent a lifetime building. Which path will he choose? Andrew Harrington, at 31 years old, was the CEO of Harrington Innovations, a private tech startup that had recently gone public. Thanks to a combination of hard work, vision, and a stroke of luck in timing the market, he'd become a millionaire practically overnight. Though his charismatic smile and perfectly tailored suits exuded confidence, Andrew was, at heart, a compassionate soul. He was often described by the press as the reluctant millionaire because he constantly downplayed his success. Yet even he could not deny the ever-escalating demands on his time and the sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He slipped into Harbour Diner that fateful evening because he needed a moment away from a world full of investors, board meetings, and financial statements. The diner was an old-fashioned spot sitting just off the highway. Its neon sign flickered in and out, and the lamppost in the parking lot sputtered in the cold. Andrew had come alone, parking his sleek black Mercedes behind a row of battered pickup trucks so no one would notice the out-of-place luxury car. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of soft jazz playing from a decades-old radio immediately comforted him. Booths lined the walls, with checked tablecloths reminiscent of simpler times. As he was glancing at the daily specials handwritten on a chalkboard, he heard a gentle voice ask if he needed a menu. He looked up to see Sophie Evans, mid-20s, hazel eyes, and a warmth about her that instantly disarmed him. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her face bore slight traces of fatigue that suggested she'd been rushing between tables all evening. In an uncharacteristic moment, Andrew found himself speechless. Sophie had a presence unlike anyone he'd met before. He managed an awkward smile and mumbled something about wanting coffee. Sophie nodded politely, taking it as a cue that he was tired, and fetched him a fresh mug. Little did they know that their brief exchange would be the foundation of a deep, complicated connection neither of them had bargained for. Andrew returned to Harbour Diner the following week, then again 2 days after that, always finding a convenient excuse to decompress, to catch up on emails away from the office, to avoid the clamour of power lunches with prospective partners. Each time, Sophie was there, hustling between tables, clearing plates, and doing her best to chat with the regular patrons who seemed to adore her. Conversation came easily. Sophie told him how she worked extra shifts to help pay off her younger brother Ryan's medical bills from a severe car accident. She casually mentioned her mother passing away years ago and how her father, a retired mechanic, struggled with an old knee injury but still insisted on tinkering in their backyard workshop. Andrew shared vague details of his family business, never hinting at the actual scale of his wealth or his prominence in the city's business circles. Their initial conversations were about the weather, local sports teams, or new menu items. Sophie had been urging her boss to try, but beneath the light-hearted banter lay an unmistakable layer of tension. Every time Andrew walked in, Sophie's cheeks flushed slightly. Every time she passed his booth, he found his pulse quickening. After a few late-night chats, when the diner was closing and the only light came from the fluorescent tubes over the counter, Andrew dared to ask for her phone number. Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting around as if someone might overhear. I don't usually give out my number to customers, she said. Her polite yet guarded response nearly made Andrew apologize and leave. But then, out of nowhere, she scribbled a series of digits on the back of a receipt. She pressed it into Andrew's hand with an almost shy smile. Just in case you have suggestions for the menu, she joked. In truth, Sophie felt something blossoming between them too. He was kind, patient, and far different from the men who left her sticky notes with clumsy pick-up lines and meaningless phone numbers. Andrew spoke to her with genuine respect. He didn't leer at her or treat her like a servant, and he actually listened when she talked about her dreams, struggles, and small triumphs. Sophie recognized that Andrew was a cut above, although she had no idea just how far above he really was. Andrew's background was complicated. He'd been raised in a well-to-do family that taught him the value of money, but also instilled in him a fierce independence. His father, Charles Harrington, was a prominent investor who believed wholeheartedly in tradition and social standing. Charles was vehemently protective of the family name and had once told Andrew that the right partner could make or break not only a reputation but also a fortune. Andrew, however, had grown weary of the shallow high society gatherings where every conversation was a veiled business inquiry. As the heir apparent to the Harrington empire, Andrew was expected to marry appropriately, which, in Charles's eyes, meant someone from a similarly affluent background. There was even talk of Andrew formally proposing to Vanessa Holmes, an heiress from another wealthy family. Vanessa had made it clear she was prepared to settle into the role of his elegant, philanthropic wife whenever he was ready. Though the press occasionally speculated about an inevitable union between Andrew and Vanessa, Andrew's heart was never truly in it. He craved a partnership built on warmth and authenticity, not a business merger disguised as matrimony. When Andrew began secretly dating Sophie, the risk was enormous. Though they tried to keep it discreet, meeting at out-of-the-way bistros or walking in public parks far from Andrew's usual social circle, he knew that if word got out, it would ignite a scandal. The rumor mills would churn, investors might question his judgment, and, worst of all, his father would almost certainly intervene. Despite his reservations, Andrew couldn't resist. Sophie's presence reminded him of who he was before the corporate world consumed him. But Andrew was no saint of secrecy. He relied on his personal assistant and confidant, Amelia Cho, to cover for him at times. Amelia had been with Andrew from the start of his career. She respected his privacy and noticed how different, how alive Andrew seemed whenever he was with Sophie. She kept his schedule flexible and intercepted any suspicious calls. Still, Andrew knew that a single stray photograph from a nosy journalist could unravel everything. Over the next month, Andrew and Sophie's relationship blossomed. He would pick her up after her shift, and they'd drive out to a secluded beach to watch the stars. Sometimes he'd bring her to his private loft above one of the city's best art galleries, a property few people knew he owned, and they'd talk about life, family, and long-term dreams until the sun rose. For a while, it was magical. The outside world ceased to exist whenever they were together. Inevitably, the question of Andrew's real identity lingered in the air. Sophie noticed his impeccable manners, his knowledge of fine wines, the way he casually checked emails about deals and used language that suggested he was far more than an average office worker. She also began to suspect that his family business was not just a small-scale operation. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Andrew's secret loft, sipping wine while the city lights twinkled, below, Sophie finally gathered the courage to ask, "Andrew, are you someone famous or something? You talk like you have a million responsibilities." Andrew's heart pounded. He considered deflecting or downplaying, but something told him this moment was crucial. With a resigned sigh, He confessed he was the CEO of Harrington Innovations and that he was wealthier than she could imagine. Sophie listened in silence, shock and a trace of betrayal evident in her expression. "So you're a millionaire," she said, letting the word hang in the air. Her voice was quiet, her gaze unfocused. Sophie wasn't angered by his wealth per se, but by the fact that Andrew had concealed so much. However, she realized that this man, whom she deeply cared for, had reasons to hide his status, reasons connected to a complicated family and a ruthless business environment. Andrew reached for her hand. "Sophie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to mislead you. I just wanted you to see me for who I am, without all the baggage." Sophie blinked back, tears. "I still see you," she said softly. "But why do I feel like everything's going to be different now?" Andrew pressed her hand to his heart. "Because it will be, if the world finds out." The next major challenge arrived in the form of an upcoming board meeting. Harrington Innovations was poised to merge with a larger conglomerate, Rockford and Vale, which promised an influx of capital and a wider global reach. Charles Harrington pushed Andrew to finalize the deal, but the contract included a curious personal clause. Rockford and Vale's board wanted assurance that Andrew was a stable family man, or at least engaged to someone of suitable background. The impetus behind this clause was mostly symbolic. The corporation valued the image of a respectable, married CEO for brand credibility. But for Andrew, it was a direct assault on his freedom to choose a partner. Vanessa Holmes, who had strong family ties to Rockford and Vale, conveniently emerged as the ideal fiancée in the eyes of both boards. She was polished from a reputable family and had a seat on the philanthropic committees that Harrington Innovations wanted to support. Investors salivated at the idea of their union because it spelled merger made in heaven. Charles Harrington dropped hints that the family fortune and Andrew's future as head of the empire hung in the balance. Andrew returned home to find his father sitting in the Manor's wood panelled library. The older man's gaze was stern. "The wedding with Vanessa, it needs to happen," Charles said flatly, resting his chin on his cane. "If you want this deal, if you want to preserve our legacy, you'll follow through." Andrew felt rage simmer beneath his skin. "I'm not a commodity to be auctioned off, Dad." Charles slammed the tip of his cane onto the floor. "This isn't about you, Andrew. It's about what's best for the company, for the family. There's more at stake here than your personal whims." Andrew clenched his fists. "It isn't a whim. I have someone, and I can't just betray her." Charles's eyes flared with cold disappointment. "If you're referring to that waitress, do you think I don't know?" he spat. "I know you've been sneaking around. End it, Andrew. You owe your loyalty to the Harrington name." Andrew stormed out, shattered and furious. The ultimatum was clear: keep Sophie and risk losing everything, or drop her and fulfill a lifelong ambition alongside a partnership he never asked for. While Andrew wrestled with this impossible dilemma, Sophie was at home, facing a crisis of her own. Her father had slipped in their driveway, aggravating his old knee injury. Doctors recommended a specialized surgery that would cost tens of thousands of dollars, money that Sophie simply didn't have. The insurance coverage was minimal, and the family's debts were already mountainous after her brother Ryan's accident. They were on the brink of financial ruin. When Sophie confided in Andrew, he immediately offered to pay for the surgery. She balked, her pride and sense of independence kicking in. Yet after a tearful conversation with Ryan, Sophie realized she had no choice but to accept. She and Andrew devised a plan. Andrew would discreetly cover the costs, and Sophie would let him do so without letting guilt consume her. For the first time in her life, Sophie hated that she couldn't manage on her own. But she was also indescribably grateful for Andrew's generosity. No sooner had they settled this, however, than a tabloid report surfaced with a grainy photo of Andrew and Sophie hugging in front of Harbour Diner. The article implied that the millionaire wonderkind Andrew Harrington was courting a lowly waitress, potentially risking the upcoming merger with Rockford and Vale. Investors panicked. Stock prices dipped. Charles Harrington retaliated behind the scenes by calling in every media contact he had to quell the rumours. Vanessa Holmes's father expressed grave concerns about the optics of Andrew's personal life. Sophie, too, felt the blow. Reporters began loitering around the diner. Customers whispered, giving her curious looks. On the rare occasion that Andrew managed to slip away to see her, they had to dodge paparazzi. Their once peaceful sanctuary was now the stuff of media speculation. Under mounting pressure, Andrew's sleep became fitful. The stress showed in his posture, in the dark circles under his eyes. The Rockford and Vale board demanded a firm answer about his engagement to Vanessa, threatening to delay or cancel the merger if he refused. Charles Harrington, furious, gave Andrew an ultimatum: either publicize an engagement to Vanessa or walk away from his role as CEO, effectively forfeiting the majority of his shares in Harrington Innovations. For Andrew, the hardest conversation was with Sophie. Sitting across from her in his private loft, he gently explained the magnitude of the pressure. He told her about the potential meltdown of his corporate empire if he refused to marry Vanessa. Sophie's face was a portrait of heartbreak. Although she cared deeply for Andrew, she also recognized how extraordinary his responsibilities were. "So what do we do?" she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "What does that mean for us?" Andrew looked away, his voice trembling. "It means I have to make a choice, one that might destroy everything we've built together." Yet Sophie, eyes brimming with tears, refused to be the reason Andrew lost his life's work. Struggling to maintain her composure, she suggested that maybe they take time apart. Andrew, pained by the very thought, pulled her close and pleaded for her to trust him, to let him find a way out of this mess. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he needed to try. In the midst of this maelstrom, a dark horse emerged. An anonymous message arrived at Andrew's email, claiming to have damaging evidence about Rockford and Vale's unethical business practices. Attached was a heavily redacted report suggesting that the conglomerate was involved in illegal environmental dumping in a third-world country. Further emails, also anonymous, accused Rockford and Vale of shady financial deals that, if exposed, would scandalize the entire board. In essence, the message implied that Andrew should use this information as leverage to renegotiate terms that did not involve his personal life. Conflicted, Andrew reached out to the only person he trusted absolutely with corporate espionage matters, Amelia Cho, his assistant. They spent hours analyzing the report. If it was authentic, it would mean Rockford and Vale were guilty of serious crimes. However, blackmailing them felt morally wrong. Yet Andrew realized this could be his only chance to cut the personal clause from the merger agreement, essentially freeing him from the forced engagement. Amelia voiced her apprehension. "Andrew, if you do this, you'll be stooping to their level. Are you sure you want to go down that path?" Andrew stared at the stack of incriminating documents. He was torn between preserving his moral high ground and salvaging his relationship with Sophie. "I can't let them pressure me into a loveless marriage," he said. "But I also refuse to be complicit if they're actually doing something illegal. Maybe I can turn this evidence over to the authorities and distance Harrington Innovations from them altogether." Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you sever ties now, you could lose the merger, and that alone could destabilize Harrington Innovations. But at least you won't have to compromise your personal life or your principles." Andrew nodded, resolute. "It's better to suffer financially for a while than to tie ourselves to corruption." Emboldened by the new plan, Andrew scheduled an urgent meeting with the Rockford and Vale representatives, including Vanessa Holmes and her father. To everyone's surprise, Andrew calmly presented the partial evidence of their alleged wrongdoing and announced he was withdrawing from the merger unless the board cooperated with a thorough, independent investigation. Vanessa was livid. "What are you doing, Andrew? You're jeopardizing everything just because..." She cast a scornful glance at a photograph of Sophie, which had been circulating in tabloids. "Because of her," Andrew took a measured breath, "I'm doing the right thing. If you and your father truly have nothing to hide, let the investigation prove your innocence. If not, then I'm protecting my company." When Charles Harrington found out about Andrew's radical move, he nearly disowned his son on the spot. He accused Andrew of throwing away the family legacy and ranted about how no one would trust Harrington Innovations now. Andrew braced himself for the worst but felt a sense of relief that at least he was no longer bound by a forced marriage arrangement. While all this corporate warfare was unfolding, Sophie received a startling phone call. It was from a woman claiming to be Vanessa Holmes. The voice on the line sounded refined yet cruel. "Miss Evans, I hear you're the one distracting Andrew. Let me make this clear. Andrew and I will be engaged soon. I'll see to it that you're blacklisted from every decent job in this city if you stand in our way." Sophie's chest tightened. She mustered enough courage to respond. "He doesn't love you," Vanessa scoffed. "Love? Please. What matters is securing the power we were both born into. You were never even in the picture. Enjoy your fling while it lasts, Waitress." As the call ended, Sophie felt her stomach churn. She knew Andrew had acted to free himself, yet the harsh reality of his social circle, a world that would never accept her, left her shaken. Uncertain about the future, Sophie considered disappearing from Andrew's life for good. After all, she thought, how could she stand in the way of a destiny that had been mapped out long before she came along? Against her own heartache, Sophie avoided Andrew's calls. She took a short leave of absence from the diner and stayed at home to care for her father post-surgery. She deliberately closed herself off from Andrew to give him the freedom to fight his corporate battles, free of distractions. She also carried a deep-rooted fear that everything Vanessa had threatened might come true. Andrew, on the other hand, spiraled. He felt Sophie's absence acutely, like a vital piece of him had gone missing. Every night he would dial her number only to be directed to voicemail. He left message after message, pleading for her to call him back, to let him explain the new developments, to promise her that everything would be all right if they just stuck together. Yet silence prevailed. 3 weeks passed. During that time, Andrew's battle with Rockford and Vale escalated. Investigations were launched, and shareholders demanded answers. The entire deal appeared poised to collapse. Some corners of the media began hailing Andrew as a hero for taking a moral stance, while others labeled him reckless for jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar opportunity. Charles Harrington retreated to his estate, refusing all contact with his son. The share prices of Harrington Innovations plummeted, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value practically overnight. Amelia, seeing Andrew's anguish, decided to make one final push to salvage both his professional life and his personal life. She began negotiating privately with smaller, more ethical investment groups, working around the clock to ensure Harrington Innovations would not go under. Bit by bit, she pieced together a new business framework, one that didn't rely on Rockford and Vale or a forced engagement. At the same time, she reached out to Sophie in secret. When Amelia told Sophie about Andrew's decision to walk away from the corrupt merger, Sophie's tear-filled eyes glowed with renewed hope, but she remained cautious. What about his father? His shares? Everything he's worked for? Amelia smiled gently. He's lost a lot, Sophie, but he's holding on to the one thing that matters to him most. Sophie's heart pounded. He's never given up on us? Not for a second, Amelia reassured her. Go to him. See for yourself. Despite her trepidation, Sophie decided to meet Andrew at the loft one late afternoon. When she stepped inside, she found him by the large windows, staring at the skyline with a haunted expression. The moment he turned and saw her, relief washed over his features, and he rushed forward to gather her in his arms. They clung to each other, tears mingling with whispers of apology and longing. Sophie stroked Andrew's cheek, noticing the fatigue etched into his eyes. "You really did it, didn't you?" she murmured. "You gave it all up." Andrew inhaled sharply, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "If giving it all up means keeping you, it's worth it 1,000 times over." But just when it seemed they had weathered the storm, another gale blew in. Charles Harrington summoned Andrew to the family estate. Unsure of his father's intentions, Andrew went, accompanied by Sophie for moral support, an act that enraged Charles. They gathered in the stately library, where Andrew had grown up playing chess among leather-bound volumes. Charles eyed Sophie with thinly veiled disdain, but kept his comments to himself, at least for the moment. "I see you've made your choice," Charles said, voice quivering with anger. "You've destroyed the merger, cost this family unimaginable wealth, and for what?" Andrew took Sophie's hand, for the truth and for love. Sophie, feeling Charles's cold stare, spoke up respectfully yet firmly. "Sir, one understand you're disappointed. Andrew's done what he believed was morally right. That might have cost some money, but—" "Money?" Charles barked, eyes flaring. "Do you have any idea how hard we worked to build this empire?" Sophie swallowed, but she held her ground. "I know Andrew respects it, but he also respects human values, which should come first." Charles seethed. For a moment, Andrew worried his father might lash out verbally. But then the old man's shoulders slumped, the fire in his eyes replaced by weary resignation. "Then perhaps it's time I let you stand on your own," Charles said, voice hollow. "Effective immediately, I'm removing you from key positions at Harrington Innovations. You'll keep a marginal stake, 10%. That's all. Vanessa's father will negotiate with another firm, and we'll proceed without you." Andrew felt the floor tilt beneath him. 10%? He'd essentially be a silent shareholder, stripped of his leadership. Yet he stood firm. "So be it," he replied quietly. "If that's the cost of living with integrity and with Sophie, then I accept." A fleeting flicker of respect crossed Charles's face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He waved them out. "Go," he muttered, turning away as though seeing them pained him. "You've made your bed. Now lie in it." Leaving the estate felt surreal, as though Andrew had closed the door on not just a chapter, but an entire identity. Gone were the illusions that he could balance the demands of his father, the company, and his heart. Yet the sense of burden lifting from his shoulders was palpable. He had chosen love, and he had also chosen to stand by his moral compass. Over the following months, Andrew and Sophie navigated a new life together. Andrew used what remained of his wealth, along with Amelia's strategic brilliance, to start a new venture, an environmentally sustainable tech firm focusing on solar battery production. Investors who admired Andrew's moral stand began to rally behind him, albeit slowly. The money trickled in, not in torrents as before, but consistently enough to build something honest. Meanwhile, Sophie took steps to ensure her family's well-being. Her father's surgery was successful and Ryan's health improved. She eventually returned to Harbour Diner, where the local patrons had grown protective and proud of their celebrity waitress. Some even teased her about marrying a millionaire, to which she always responded with a laugh that Andrew was not the same millionaire. He once was, he was now something better, a man freed from illusions, forging a new path with her by his side. One day, Charles Harrington showed up unannounced at Andrew's small, newly rented office. The older man's hair seemed grayer, and his once commanding presence looked subdued. A hush fell over the room as employees recognized him. Nervous glances were exchanged, but Andrew stepped forward, determined to maintain composure. Charles cleared his throat. "I've been following what you're doing here, Andrew. Ethical technology, sustainable solutions. Investors seem impressed by your approach." Andrew nodded politely, uncertain where this was going. "We're trying our best, Father." Charles's gaze flicked over to Sophie, who stood in the corner, sorting through marketing brochures. At first, Sophie froze, expecting hostility. Instead, Charles merely sighed. "I see you're both making a life for yourselves." Andrew guided Charles to a small conference room for privacy. To his astonishment, Charles apologized haltingly and without his usual bluster. He admitted that, in his anger, he'd overlooked the significance of Andrew's stance and Sophie's unwavering support. He also confessed that the negative press swirling around Rockford and Vale had tanked their public image, vindicating Andrew's earlier decision to pull out of the merger. For the first time, Andrew heard regret in his father's voice. "It's not easy for me to say this," Charles murmured, "but I respect what you did, and I'd like to help, if you'll allow me." Andrew felt tears threaten to well up. He remembered the harsh words, the disapproval, the feeling of being disowned. Yet this was a father, not a tyrant. "I appreciate it," Andrew said softly, "but I don't want any handouts. If you believe in what we're building, invest in the company like anyone else. Otherwise, let us be." Charles pressed his lips together. "I understand. Perhaps I will." It wasn't an outright reconciliation, but it was a start. Weeks later, in a gesture that felt symbolic, Andrew took Sophie to a quiet clearing in the countryside. Surrounded by tall grass swaying under a golden sunset, he knelt on one knee, a ring in his hand. But it wasn't the glimmering diamond worth a fortune. It was a simple band, elegant but unpretentious. "I've lost many things," Andrew said, voice trembling with emotion, "but I've never regretted loving you. Will you be my wife, Sophie Evans?" Tears streaked Sophie's cheeks as she laughed and cried all at once. "Yes, Andrew. 1,000 times, yes." In that moment, under the vast open sky, Andrew finally felt certain of his path. The man who once measured success by shareholder returns and lavish deals now measured it by the depth of his love and the honesty of his actions. A new chapter was beginning, one that might not be easy, but one that was undeniably real. And so, Andrew Harrington discovered that true wealth lies not in corporate acquisitions or million-dollar bank accounts, but in the bonds we form with those who love us for who we are. Against all odds, his choice was clear: sacrifice a measure of his fortune for the sake of integrity, honesty, and deep devotion. With Sophie Evans by his side, he embarked on a new, uncharted road, one built on sustainable innovation, genuine partnerships, and a love story that triumphed over scandal and doubt. If you enjoyed this tale of secret romance, impossible choices, and unexpected redemption, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Share the story with friends who love uplifting dramas, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us it's never too late to follow our hearts and carve our own path to happiness.